All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? So, again, welcome for those of you who aren't familiar with me. I'm Angela Brown, the manager of B2B brand strategy at Niche. And in this session today, we're going to go over some of our recent data that looks at what we've heard from families this year, some school search trends, and some enrollment performance trends that we heard about from Catholic schools. So, before we get started, housekeeping as usual. Our biggest question, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to you around midday tomorrow. A podcast version, audio only, will also be available in the Enrollment Insights podcast feed. So, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. At the end, I will answer any questions that were submitted during registration first. We just had a couple, so that won't take too long. And then I'll get to questions that come in during the event. You are welcome to ask them as they pop into your brain or hold them at the end, but that is when I will be taking them. And you can do that on the right side of your screen in the Q&A. You probably noticed that things look a little different around here. We are using a new webinar platform. And then if you have a question about grades, rankings, or your niche account specifically, just shoot me a note offline so that we can cover those one-on-one. So here's a look at what we're going to get into today. We'll start with some highlights from the broader market. We'll zoom in a bit on Catholic schools, and then we'll talk about how you can connect the dots with the data that we go over today before we get into questions. So this is just a high level view of our approach to data at Niche. Niche typically covers 3 levels or tiers of data. And in this session, we're going to focus on just a couple, the top 2. Internally, we believe it's really important to understand and use data across all of these levels to get to real value. And those are the insights that help you to make decisions and shape your strategy. So starting with high level market data, this is just keeping tabs on what's going on. We want to know what's happening in the world around us, what's changing, so that we can appropriately respond and build products and features to help students, families, and schools. But it's also really useful to you. There's a phrase that I have found myself saying a lot lately, and I certainly experienced this when I was working in-house as a marketing communications director. And that is there are marketing problems and there are market problems. And it's really important to understand the difference between the two. You really want to think about, especially when it comes to things like enrollment and brand perception, what can be solved with marketing and where there might be some bigger challenges that marketing can't solve. It's really important to have that insight. Then, as we get into unique market data, just given the volume of users that we have on our platform, we're able to generate some really unique data and find signals and insights that can inform our work internally and, again, help folks like you. And then we have the personalized data. And so your schools are represented on the platform, as you know, and we can look at signals that are generated from parents and provide some unique data and insights about your school specifically with our monthly insights reports, which I'm sure some of you receive. So we're going to start at a high level using Google Trends, which is one of my favorite tools for getting a high level view of relative search popularity over time. You can also narrow things down by state and metro area. So that's a little tool that you can add to your toolkit if it's not something that you're using already. When you really zoom out, so here we're looking at a wider window, changes in search volume for the term private schools from January of 2020. So just as the pandemic was ramping up through December 31st of 2023. And you can see that it's been pretty consistent with the exception of the winter holiday season and around the 4th of July, which is pretty common. So we'll take a look at how this translates for Catholic schools in a bit, but I wanted to give you a sense of what search volume looks like for private schools more broadly. And then when we look just at 2023, you can see again, it's very stable with that natural dip that we tend to see during those seasonal periods of time. So this is from our State of Enrollment and Marketing Survey. This is an annual professional survey that we do of people working in schools. We have a public school version, and we also have a private and independent school version, which is where this data comes from. So we look at a few components of enrollment performance, starting with inquiries, and we see that about 50% of schools saw an increase in inquiries year over year. Coming into the fall of 2023, 14% had less, and 35% were relatively flat, within 10%. When we look at applications, 48% had more. So families were continuing to move through the funnel for the most part. 22% had less, and 30% were relatively flat. One thing that I want to mention is that we also look at the number of schools who achieved their enrollment goals for newly enrolled students. We use a June 1st date because that's a contract binding date for independent schools, and that helps us to standardize the timing. 27% of schools last year reported that they achieved that goal by June 1st, while 30% did not. And then the percentage of schools that reported achieving their goals for new students by that standard date, that's actually declined every year since 2021 when we first started doing this survey. So it's an interesting data point to look at. And that is probably why enrollment priorities look the way that they do for this year. So we asked schools what their biggest priorities were coming into 2023-24. Retention and increasing overall enrollment were the top priorities for schools across the private and independent school spectrum, followed by student parent experience in the top three. And given the impact that that tends to have on the top two, no surprises there. Now, this graphic, we're going to talk a little bit about some higher level obstacles. And this top graphic represents search volume for public versus private schools. That's always a consideration, which is pretty consistent. As you can see, there's that spike in 2022. And my theory there is that a lot of parents who had chosen private schools to get through pandemic closures were wondering if they might be able to save a little bit of money going into the next year. When we double click or go further into regions where the term was the most popular, we also see that in a lot of cases, it's in states that have fairly high tuition costs relative to the broader market, which I will get to on the next slide. So here, these are some data points from our parent survey. And so one of the questions that we asked that was actually new last year was how many schools did you consider when you were going through the process of evaluating schools for your children? 64% of parents considered 3 or more schools in the school search process, and 23% considered 5 or more. For families that chose Catholic schools for this year, it was pretty close. 66% looked at 3 or more, 26% considered 5 or more. One thing that we noticed was an increase in price sensitivity this year. So we asked parents this was another new question this year, about the factors that would cause them to remove a school from consideration as they're going through the process. And 20% of parents said that a lack of financial aid was a factor in removing schools from consideration. That number comes down to 13% for Catholic schools. And I believe that that is likely because Catholic schools tend to be, in general, more moderately priced compared to independent schools, which can cost 2 to 3 times more in a lot of markets. And so you're already dealing with a population of families who are looking at lower cost schools, so they're not quite as concerned about financial aid. And then looking at tuition cost even more, we also ask parents what the important deciding factors were as they're going through the process of choosing a school. So when you get to that point where you're making your final choice, what are the things that are most important and have the greatest impact on your decision? And this year we saw that a large percentage of families, 60% actually, said that tuition cost was an important deciding factor. And that was an increase from 51% the previous year. But for Catholic school families, and this was interesting, 75% said that tuition cost was an important deciding factor for the school they chose. And again, I think that's because we're just dealing with a population of families who are already inherently price sensitive. And so it just makes that much more of an impact. So when we kind of drill down into that list of what caused parents to remove schools from their short list, these are the data points that represent all of the parents who took the survey. So we see finding reviews, lack of diversity, interactions with school staff, negative visit experience. That financial aid piece comes back into play. For families who chose Catholic schools, 65% said that difficulty finding reviews and negative reviews would cause them to remove a school from the list. So very close to the broader population. 30% cited a negative visit experience. So that on-campus experience is actually even more important to families looking at Catholic schools than the broader population. 21% said lack of diversity, which is slightly lower than what we saw with the broader population. 21% also cited negative interactions with school staff. So that was right on par, just about with what we saw with broader survey responses. And then 13%, again, as I mentioned, that referenced the lack of financial aid. And then this is a really interesting chart that we decided to represent visually for the first time last year. We've always had this information, but I think it really points to the gap between what parents are thinking about, what they're considering, and what they actually choose. So you can see the bar chart, the bars in green represent consideration. So that's the percentage of parents who considered a certain type of school. And then the pink shows what they actually chose. And in every single school category, there's a pretty decent gap. But we notice that Catholic schools are different. So this slide represents the highest number of responses. These were the types of schools that had the most families who considered them and chose them. So Catholic schools are not reflected here because they're actually a subset, a sub-choice under religious private schools. But when we do drill down on Catholic schools, 90% of families who chose Catholic schools were looking at religious private schools. So we have that percentage of families who they're looking at religious privates. We see that represented here. And then within that, 90% of families chose Catholic schools. They were looking at other denominations, but 90% of them chose Catholic schools. And then 97% considered Catholic schools and chose Catholic schools. So it's a really interesting, much narrower gap. But then we also see that 35% considered public schools, and families who considered Catholic schools, as I mentioned, they considered other affiliations. So it's really that's where it's helpful to have that broader picture of the market. In terms of where these families came from, I think there's a common misperception that families are fleeing public schools and they're all coming from public schools and going to Catholic schools. But we actually saw that 22% came from public schools, but 63% came from other religious private schools. So that's an interesting thing there. There's a few different things that could come into play. Maybe they're coming from feeders. There's lots of different factors, but I did think that that was interesting as a consideration. Now, I do want to take some time to talk about something that we all know to be true, which is that digital trends are always changing. We're always hearing about new platforms, new things that you should be doing or should be using. And I don't advocate for necessarily chasing every new platform that makes the news, but it is important to understand what the broader trends are and some generational shifts that are occurring that could impact your strategy. And this is an interesting one. This graph, again from Google Trends, shows search volume for Facebook specifically over time. It aligns with something that we've been hearing for a while now, which is that overall traffic and user volume on Facebook has been slowly declining. But when we look at data around how parents are engaging with schools, we see a different story because many parents of school age children are still part of generations and demographic age groups that are active on this platform. So overall, 21% of families who took our parent survey said that parent groups were their preferred online tool for comparing schools. So they're in those local Facebook groups that we all know and love, asking for feedback on everything from a specific school to starting from scratch and saying, hey, I'm looking for a fill in the blank type school. What do you recommend? Facebook groups were also the most influential social media channel for choice, followed by organic posts. This was actually the first year that we saw Facebook groups overtake posts from schools and influencing enrollment, and then followed by Instagram and YouTube. So when we look at how that translates into Catholic school families, 19% versus 21% overall said that Facebook groups were a preferred tool. So very, very close. Instagram was actually the most influential channel for enrollment at 37% for Catholic school families. So if you are not on Instagram or your Instagram account has been neglected, definitely spend a little bit more time there. Then that was followed by Facebook groups at 22% and organic Facebook posts at 21%. So Instagram, Facebook, things in that Meta family are still very much in play for Catholic school families and families overall. And because YouTube was actually very high in consideration more broadly, I included that here. So here's a quick look at search volumes for Instagram and YouTube. And you can see that generally there's more stability here. These are both, YouTube is still very much king when it comes to video, as much as people talk about TikTok. It's very close to TikTok when we look at student and parent interaction with social channels in the school search process. And Instagram just being a newer channel and a little bit more cross-generationally friendly, I should say, is showing some more stability, although, slightly on a downward trend line compared to YouTube. So if you have some room in your toolkit for social media and you're not using YouTube, that's one that to definitely keep an eye on. It could become an emerging channel for both parent and student engagement in the future. And then finally, of course, I have to put in a plug for niche, but this is very real because our data actually bears this out. So this is a look at search volume trends for niche.com specifically over that January of 2020 to December of 2023 time period. This does represent a cross section of audiences for both higher ed and K-12, but our parent survey data actually supports this quite a bit. So when we ask parents what the top discovery sources were for finding the schools that they decided to consider coming into the fall of 2023, Google search was the top one, followed by word of mouth, and then school search and review platforms. It's pretty consistent for Catholic school families, except there was a higher percentage of Catholic school families who were already familiar with the schools that they considered. So brand awareness is really important with families who ultimately chose Catholic schools. When we asked about preferred online research tools, there's that question again. We mentioned Facebook in the past, but search and review platforms were at the very top at 79%. It was actually 81% when we look at Catholic school families, so even more important by a little bit. And then parents love to hear from other parents. The search and review platform piece definitely speaks to that. 67% of parents said reviews from other parents on school search and review platforms influence their decisions. And that's at 64% for Catholic school families. So very, very close there. So as we zoom in even further, bringing it back to Google search trends, I wanted to do a comparison between private schools more broadly and Catholic schools specifically. So we have Catholic schools at the top and private schools at the bottom. You can see that search volume for Catholic schools spiked in the early COVID days before kind of leveling off. But then we see what I call reactionary peaks in the winter months when families start to realize that their current options might not be working for them. And so they start to consider something else. And this is actually a slightly different pattern from what we typically see on the niche platform more broadly, where we have a spike in the fall and then the drops in volume during the winter holidays and around the 4th of July are pretty consistent across the board. But it's a bit more up and down with search volume for Catholic schools specifically. And then if we look at just 2023, again, with Catholic schools at the top, we see a little bit more consistency, although the seasonal drops are a bit more pronounced for Catholic schools relative to private schools more broadly. And that could very well be that some families are just starting broad, so it's not necessarily something to worry about, but it's definitely something that's worth keeping an eye on. So this is a look at search volume for Catholic schools on the niche platform in all of 2023. This is from one of our market reports, which are really, really great resources. We have them by school type, by metro area for all of the US. This is looking at all of the United States. And again, this just speaks to the point that I made earlier of understanding what's happening in your market in addition to keeping an eye on the regular KPIs that you might be monitoring from an enrollment and marketing standpoint, because again, there might be some things happening in your market that can't be addressed with marketing. You may be in a situation where if you're looking at search volume for your school type and you see that it's very, very low in your area relative to other parts of the country or To take it even further, if you do some market research, which I do encourage schools to do, at least every couple of years, every 5 years, if you need to stretch it out that far, but to get a sense for how are birth rates trending in your market versus the rest of the United States? What are demographic shifts are happening in terms of household income? Are there other types of schools that are opening in your market that are more appealing to families? Those are the types of things that you're really going to want to dig into as you're thinking about enrollment. So it's not just about, okay, let's throw some more ads at it or, throw more money at it or get into the community and try these other tactical things. There may be some market dynamics at play impacting your enrollment that might require some tougher operational choices that go beyond the marketing department. And so I think it's really important to be mindful of that. So as you can see, the market reports show total reviews or total views for Catholic schools on the platform in 2023. And then we break it down by US versus international, top states, top metros, and then top international markets. And this is something that that we do for a wide range of types of schools and different time intervals that can be really useful. So earlier we looked at enrollment performance among all private and independent school professionals who took our State of Enrollment and Marketing survey. Now we're going to look specifically at what we heard from religious private schools. Unfortunately, I don't have Catholic school specific data for this one. We stop at religious privates. But it can give you an idea of where you might fall. We don't like to drill down too far sometimes because we want to make sure that we have some statistical significance with our data. So, starting with inquiries, 51% of religious private schools reported having more inquiries, 12% reported having less, and 37% were flat. That's pretty close to what we saw overall, which is some good news there. And then when we look at applications, we had 52% who had more, 18% had less, 31% were flat. Again, good news for the most part. So 48% of the broader survey responses had more applications, 22% had less. So religious privates doing a little bit better here. And then 30% of all private and independent schools who took the survey were reporting flat applications. So again, right on par there. And then as we look at enrollment priorities, spot on with the broader survey responses, but this was actually to a higher degree. So religious private schools are prioritizing retention, increasing enrollment, and student and parent experience even more than their peers of other private and independent school types. And now, of course, this is important, right? We want to know what's important to families who choose Catholic schools. And this is a little bit different, actually, from what we see with our broader survey. There are some similarities, but things are in different orders. So, small class sizes was actually number one for families who specifically enrolled their children in Catholic schools. School type was a big one. That's a callback to what we talked about earlier, where we had a high number of families consider Catholic schools and ultimately choose Catholic schools. Sense of community was really, really big. We mentioned tuition cost, high quality teachers. That's something that is pretty consistent with what we see with other school types. Campus safety, character education, really big among families who choose Catholic schools. Reviews from other parents, no surprise there. We see that across the board. And then we're rounded out with social emotional development. And these were top factors by a mile compared to other things like facilities and parent involvement in curriculum. We asked about a lot of factors, actually, and these were the most important things that parents referenced. And then when it comes to communications and tools that Catholic school families said influence their decisions, of course, you want to know about this one, right? You want to know that you're investing where you should be. And this was interesting because school websites were the top for the broader parent population surveyed, but school visits, again, that on campus experience for families choosing Catholic schools is absolutely huge. So, if there is one thing that you take away from this presentation as you think about your next enrollment cycle, it's really, really leaning into having a fabulous school visit situation. But not always for formal events. So this is something where it's going to take a village because we also see that the first point of contact for 37% of families who chose Catholic schools is to just show up on campus. And so you might have people come to campus who you have not heard from, and that's something to be prepared for. It was 28% for broader survey responses. So Catholic school families really want to get onto campus, and it's important that they have a really, really stellar experience when that happens. Then we see school websites, search and review platforms, emails from the schools, social media content, and then finally brochures and view books, which, as you think about things like that, since those are pieces that can be very costly and time consuming to create and produce, those tend to be most impactful later in the process. And so, if you're trying to think about how you're allocating your budget, you don't need as many of those as you might think you do from a print production standpoint. And if there's a way that you can present that information digitally so it's easy to share with families later on in the process, that's definitely a good move. So, as we think about how we connect the dots, these are very philosophical and just sort of speak to the way that we approach data at Niche. But it's also very helpful to think about as an admissions marketing professional or all of the above, since I know many of you are wearing multiple hats. I did a workshop earlier this week when I asked how many people in the room had only one job and no one raised their hand. But data is a foundation for storytelling. So as you're doing a readout to other stakeholders in your community, think about the story that you want to tell. And that can really help you kind of walk it back from there as you're thinking about what of all of the data that you might have available to you you actually want to share. It can be a map for opportunities and insights, which we've seen. We've talked about how data can inform your planning. It can help you understand what's happening in the market and help you control the controllables. And it helps you to find out something new that you might not have known before. That's why we love creating these surveys and doing these webinars because we enjoy learning this information as well. And it can change quite a bit in some cases. And so that's why we have a real commitment to providing you with actionable data on an annual basis. There's some data that you can get from, the Department of Ed and other places that can get dated very quickly, especially the information that's publicly available. So we really try as a service to the industry to produce data on a more regular basis than that. And then just a few ideas for some ways that you can use the information here and in some of the other tools and resources that we've shared. Competitor benchmarking, very, very, very important. One thing that I tell people a lot is that your competitors are not always who you think they are. So it's really important in your applicant surveys of families who have gone through your process, your new family surveys, which I hope you're doing, to ask who else were you compared to? And for families that went through the process with you and went somewhere else, where did they go? That those are the types of things that can give you some insight into who your true competitors are and not just the assumptions that are being made internally. Third party data for internal communications and strategy development. This is a great example of that. Budget planning and reallocation. I am a big believer in using data on a regular basis to make sure that your enrollment marketing plan is a living, breathing thing. It is not something to create over the summer and then go unchanged until you get to the spring. Especially when it comes to your digital marketing tactics, you want to make sure that you're looking at that data and you're making refinements so that you don't leave money on the table. And then, of course, my most favorite thing, because again, all of you have many, many things on your plates, is using data to take things off your list. To say, no, we actually shouldn't invest in fill in the blank tactic because the data shows that it doesn't move the needle with parents, or actually, we're going to stop doing this and reallocate money to something else because this other thing isn't working. So use data to make refinements to your strategy, to your tactics. And if you can take something off the list entirely, that can be a great thing. So now we're going to get into our advanced questions. As I mentioned, we've only got a couple. So this first one, I love this one. This is from Brianna, and this is Brianna's with a school that's part of the Christo Way network, which I love. They're a great group of folks. I actually did a webinar for them last year, and we talked about some of this. Hopefully, that recording is still available, so you can check it out, Brianna. Since I can't dig into a full deep dive here, but the question is for those who will be listening to this audio only. The income demographic that we serve is exclusively of limited economic means, so it can be a little different than those just searching for Catholic schools that don't have to worry about the cost of tuition. When looking at the data as a whole as compared to by income, what differences, if any, are there? And the short answer is there are differences, but there actually aren't very many. So I'll stick to the things that we kind of ran through in this presentation, just in the interest of time. But low income families, in terms of the things that they were worried about, they were more concerned about social challenges at school. That was one of the factors that we asked about, like, what are the things that are important to you as you're looking at schools? We had a slide about that a little bit ago. Where we had school type was very high, and community, all of that. Low income families were really concerned about social challenges, and they were also more concerned about school rankings, which was interesting. But other concerns that they had around academics, campus safety, very much on par with what we saw with other families. As far as research tools go, they use the same research tools as other families, but with actually a bigger emphasis on Google search and reviews. And then when we looked at financial aid and price sensitivity, no surprise here, low income families were more likely to be concerned about financial aid than people in the broader survey, and more likely to be concerned than the smaller 13% number that we looked at. I looked at low income families in general, and it was 26% instead of the 20% more broadly and the 13% of families who chose Catholic schools. So they are more price sensitive. They're using the same tools that other families are using, even regardless of socioeconomic status. Most people have access to smartphones. They have a way to get to the internet if they need to. And as far as concerns go, social emotional challenges, school rankings, these are things that most schools are promoting anyway. And so it's not quite as much of a distinction as you might assume. And then our next advanced question, this is from David, and it is, do you have segmented data by age or grade grouping, such as pre-K, K, elementary, or middle? And so the answer for this one is that we actually used to run our parent survey in this exact way. We had a preschool version, we had a K to 8 version. At one point, we split out seventh and eighth grade because that tends to be solidly middle school in most cases versus 9-12. And we tried a few different things, and we found a couple of things. One is that the percentage of pre-K families represented was so small and got progressively smaller over time that it wasn't statistically significant. And so we actually stopped segmenting out pre-K families. And then in the broader survey, we actually found that our audience found more value in data presented at the K-12 level instead of segmenting by specific age groups. So all of that is to say, if there is something specific that you'd like to dig into, I can definitely help you out with that online, but it's not, or offline, but it's not data that I have available offhand. Okay, so now it's time to get to our live questions. Oh, yes, this is similar to the last one. So, for trends on families who transfer, on where families transfer from and social channel usage, do we have breaks in the information for K to 8 versus 9 through 12 Catholic schools? We do. I worry, though, that if we drill down that far, the data might get a little dicey. I'd have to go back and look at the number of parents that we have that made that choice and see what that breakdown looks like, since we do ask every parent who takes the survey about entering grades for the upcoming year. So we definitely have it. I would just need to take a look and see if there are enough of them based on that breakdown to provide the kind of insight that you might be looking for. Hopefully that helped. How do you best suggest running a market analysis? So, this is typically something where you're going to need to recruit a third party to help you with. Our market reports can definitely be a place to start. So, please get in touch with me. Um, and, I'm happy to connect you with your PM or someone from our data team who can get that for you. But when I have done that type of work in the past, I've actually hired a market research firm to do that for me. And so, but it's there's a cost involved for sure, but it's a very, very useful batch of information to have and to layer on top of information that you might have internally. Okay. Next question is, do you have data on why people leave Catholic and private schools? Um, we do. Again, that would require some segmentation that I have not done yet, but can certainly do for you. We do have a section in the parent survey. I don't have the data off the top of my head, but we do ask people why they left their previous school. Academic concerns was a big one. I think that was actually the top one that I remember offhand. But I'll include a link to the parent survey so that you can see what the broader reasons were. And if you send me an email, my email's on the screen. I can pull that information for you on why people left Catholic and private schools specifically. But that's another one where I would want to add the disclaimer to see just how many families who made a change last year left a Catholic and private religious school. So there's a little bit of extra work that I would need to do just to one answer that question, but also make sure that the information is valid. Okay. You mentioned a Christmas time bump in Catholic school search. That's actually it's not it's a dip and not a bump. And so and is this specific to families currently in public school or those at other private schools? I'm actually not sure because that was Google Trends data and it doesn't drill down to that level. So to be honest with you, I'm not certain what the breakdown of families are. Based on what we see on our platform, it could be a combination of the two. And based on the data that we saw for where families are coming from, it's definitely both. So I don't know that it's necessarily um, super useful to make that distinction. I would just plan on knowing that you're probably getting families for both and having a plan for engaging with both types of families. Okay, another question. I may have missed this talking point, but can data be separated by location, zip code, etc.? Can you clarify if you're asking about our data or the Google Trends data, Ted, if you're still on? Okay, we've got a few folks in the chat. I'm just going to jump over there and check those. Can we get the slides via email? Absolutely. Those will be included in the resources you receive tomorrow. Will you be sharing the video recording after? Absolutely. Will this be rerun? It will not, but you'll get the recording. We have a thank you. You're very welcome. Okay, grateful for the work. Google Trends. Can you explain this in more detail? Sure. So Google Trends, if you Google Trends, it is a free resource from Google that allows you to look at search volume for basically any word or phrase you could possibly think of. And you can get a high level view. You can drill down by time frame. You can look at specific regions. It's got maps. It's very, very helpful in terms of getting a sense for what people are looking for, especially since Google is still, by miles and miles, the absolute king when it comes to search. I know there's a lot of other search engines out there for sure. Um, but Google is still very much king. So having that kind of information can give you a little bit of a sense for what people are looking for in search behavior in your market around different terms. Hopefully that's helpful. Oh, my friend Megan. Is there data differentiation for independent Catholic schools versus parochial? There is not. No, we did not drill down quite that far, but great question. Okay, I'm going to hop back over. Not familiar with Google Trends. Can anyone use this service? Yes, you can. It's free and readily available to you. Ted is asking about so the data, Ted, was from a variety of sources. Some of it's ours, some of it's from Google. We can do market level data by metro area. I'd have to actually check to see if we can get down as far as zip code. Google Trends data, you definitely can. Our parent survey data, we did not drill down that far. The furthest we go is by census region. But if you're trying to get down into, specific zip codes and that kind of information, that's where I think it's really helpful to do a market research study and to look into getting a third party resource to do that for you, because that's the exact kind of information that you would be able to gather. Okay. We've got 3 minutes left. Are there any more questions before we wrap? Oh, you're all so welcome. Thank you for the thank yous. Okay, wonderful. I do have one more thing for you then before we go, and that is a shameless plug for our 2024 PK-12 Virtual Enrollment and Marketing Summit. If you love some good old-fashioned free professional development, please join us on April 18th from 10 to 5. We have 10 sessions for you. All of them will be recorded. We have some general sessions this year, as well as some segmented sessions for public schools, which are not relevant to you, but also private and independent schools with some really, really great sessions planned. That sign up link is live and will be included in the PDF file for this presentation that you will all get a link to tomorrow. And if you can't make it on the 18th, not a problem. Go ahead and sign up just to make sure that you get those recordings, which you will also be able to share with colleagues and friends. So would love to see you there. It is my favorite event that we do. I just love, connecting with the folks who attend, and would love to have you there. So with that, we will go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you all for sticking with me this afternoon, and we'll see you at the next one.